From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we are proud to claim the title of United States Marine. Yeehaw!
Ugh, why are you singing that, Alex?
Mostly just to annoy you. But I'm pretty disgusted myself. But there's a very good reason for this. Today we're going to be talking about one of Mexico's most famous landmarks. I mean, if it's one of the biggest urban parks in the world, is it a landmark specifically, or is it a thing unto itself?
I think it's a collection of landmarks. But yeah, I don't know. It's got so much in it that it's kind of like hard to describe it.
It's a collection of landmarks that are so famous unto themselves that there is another song about literally the fence that goes around this landmark.
Every child, at least in Mexico City for sure, and that's a lot of children, will know and will sing growing up.
Las rejas de Chapultepec son verdes, nada más para
usted.
Well, nicely done. Today we're talking about Chapultepec Park. After this very musical start, I'd also like to toot my own horn further, because even though it was your idea for us to talk about this today, turns out I'm, I think, pretty well qualified to talk about this, because before I was a historian, before I was anything really, I was a teenager who was also a guide at Chapultepec Castle.
I remember that. That was, for how long was that?
It was a summer, but I was 18, so it felt like a year.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, Chapultepec Castle is probably the most emblematic part, definitely, of Chapultepec Park, but one of the biggest sort of monuments in Mexico City. A must visit when you're in Mexico City.
Exactly right. It's atop the hill of Chapultepec, which, as people in the know will know, is the hill of the grasshopper, the El Cerro del Chapulín. Gives the whole park its name, and atop that hill is a castle that used to be a military academy, which is why I sang a small and barely tolerable section of the hymn of the United States Marines, because the first line in that song refers to not necessarily Chapultepec specifically, but to Montezuma's halls. Now, when we think of Montezuma's halls, we could think of Mexico City generally, but really, if you think of the final and climactic battle of the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848, the last sort of hurrah of the Mexican army against the Americans, the last little bit of resistance, happened at that castle, at Chapultepec Castle. And it's the United States' first sort of big imperial foray into the world. And so that's why it's the very first line of the hymn of the United States Marines. I'll have you note, by the way, that they talk about that battle which they won, but not the battle that the Marines lost in that war during the siege of Los Angeles, where they got chased out and had to jump back onto their ship, which was called something like the Bandit. I'll have to look it up. It was called something like the Bandit, and they had to rush off with their tails between their legs after getting chased out.
It's incredibly symbolic of the broader behavior that the invasion was. But they definitely do march their way very triumphantly into Mexico City. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but Chapultepec holds a very important place in the sort of monumental narrative of the final great heroic defense of the city.
And not only that, it is, in many respects, Chapultepec Park is a microcosm of the entirety of Mexican history. In fact, I'd like to take you way back, way before the invasion of the United States, to pre-Hispanic times, because even then, Chapultepec was of crucial importance to the Valley of Mexico and to one of the great centers of culture in the Americas during the sort of pre-modern age.
I mean, one would argue that the Aztecs are really only able to become the great power that they became thanks to Chapultepec.
Exactly right, because before it was a castle, it was many other things, we'll get to that, but right at the beginning, overall, it was a freshwater spring on the outskirts of what was an enormous valley, at the center of which lay an inland sea, crucially, made up of salt water, what we now call the Lake of Texcoco. And when the Aztecs, the Mexicas, arrived in Mexico City, before it was Mexico City, before they founded it, they found a valley that was pretty much occupied by a bunch of other cultures. The main ones being the people who ran Azcapotzalco, the great sort of Altepetl, the great sort of city-state of the area. And these Tepanecs, as the people from Azcapotzalco were called, sort of hired the Mexicas, who would become known as the Aztecs, to be their bodyguards. And of course, as we all know, never hire someone who's actually stronger than you, because eventually they'll turn on you. And that's exactly what happened. And the way that the war between the Mexicas and the Tepanecs started, it seems, according to legend and a lot of history, that it was that spring in Chapultepec, the aqueduct that took fresh water into the saltier parts of the valley, was a crucial strategic piece of infrastructure, and the Mexicas wanted in. I think they knew that they'd get rejected, and so when they inevitably were rebuffed, that was the casus belli for war with the Tepanecs, which led to the conquest of the Valley of Mexico by the Mexicas, which led to the conquest of the rest of, we'll say, half of Mesoamerica by the Aztecs, which is what the Spanish find when they arrive in Mexico in 1519.
And we cannot overstress the importance of this spring that comes from Chapultepec. The spring is no longer there. It ran out somewhere in the late 19th century, early 20th century, because of just an overly large population in Mexico City by then. But the history of water is at the heart, or like managing water is at the heart of the history of Mexico City. When the zombie apocalypse finally comes, we can be certain that the bulk of what today is Mexico City will disappear, because we pump out the water all the time. Like every summer, Mexico has not a continental climate with like 4 seasons. It has much more of a monsoon time climate where every summer you just get 3 months of pouring rain nonstop every day. And then you have a dry season. And that is why there was an inland sea in the first place. It's a valley system, and all the water from the mountains around has to go somewhere. And it has no way out, right? Thus the inland sea. That water accumulates there. And if we were to pump it out every year, it would accumulate again. So knowing how to manage this excess water, which is originally fresh water, and then becomes salt water as it begins to evaporate, is at the heart of being able to survive in Mexico City.
And this is immediately apparent to anyone who comes to Mexico City, not only tourists who find themselves in their flip-flops and shorts, shivering under a newspaper as a freezing cold shower of water comes over them in the middle of summer, but also it was apparent to the Spanish when they arrived. And a big part of the siege of Tenochtitlan, which is the historic name of Mexico City under the Mexica, was to cut off water supplies, thus starving them out of the most important thing they needed, which was fresh water at the time. And so the Spanish arrive, they destroy not only large sections of the old pre-Hispanic aqueduct, and they destroy enormous parts of that world that previously existed. But small amounts still persist, including one of the most beautiful things in Chapultepec Park.
And that is, of course, El Sargento, the sergeant, which is the name given to a massive ahuehuete, a type of cypress tree that exists in Chapultepec, which was allegedly planted by the Tlatoani emperor, king Netzahualcoyotl in the 15th century. And the thing about ahuehuetes is that they can live forever, basically. So this tree lived for 500 years and died until 1969. But the remains of the tree are still there, still standing, because it's a hardwood and it just manages to remain there, rotting slowly, but incredibly slowly. So if you go to Chapultepec, you can still see the remains of the sergeant.
And you can pay your respects not only to this wonderful tree or the remains of the tree, but also to another part of Mexico's hydraulic history, right? The use of ahuehuetes was crucial in the maintenance of the water systems that the Aztecs had, and you can still visit in the south of Mexico City, in the area of Xochimilco.
Actually, ahuehuete comes from the Nahuatl. Well, it's a Nahuatl word, and it literally means old man of the water, because these trees thrive in and around water. Atl is water, Huehuetl is old man in Nahuatl, Ahuehuetl, old man of water. The other thing that I think is fascinating is, though the bulk of the pre-Hispanic aqueduct is gone, you can still see the remains of the aqueduct that was then built in the Hispanic era. You can still see remains of the aqueduct that was rebuilt then by the Spanish during the time of the Spanish colony. And it follows a street called Avenida Chapultepec. And it's called Avenida Chapultepec because it connects Chapultepec Park and Chapultepec Castle to Mexico City. And this is exactly the same route that the aqueduct built by the Aztecs would have followed before 1519.
There's still bits and pieces of it, decorative,
Right.
but they're still there.
Yeah, like when you drive down Avenida Chapultepec, which is the opposite of peaceful and, like beautiful, life-bringing water, you can see some of the remains.
And there are other things that used to exist that don't quite exist in the same way as they did back then, a bit in the style of the aqueduct, which is the zoo. Apparently Moctezuma, the Tlatoani that met with the Spanish and was captured by them, he was a big fan of having a zoo of exotic animals from all across the empire. And to this day, Chapultepec Zoo is one of the biggest attractions to most tourists who come to Mexico City, especially because it's the home of one of the rarest things in the world, which is a panda that was not born in China. This now 35-year-old panda, Shin, was born in Mexico City Zoo, which, as people who know pandas know well, they are just impossible to get to reproduce. They will sit around each other, eat bamboo.
They refuse to exist as a species. They just don't want to be alive. They don't want to reproduce.
But there's just something in the air here in Mexico City in Chapultepec Park that really got the juices flowing. And thus, we now have one of the few panda born outside of China in captivity.
That's the thing. Like, when the heyday of the PRI, when the Mexican economy is still functioning properly, the Chapultepec Zoo was quite a highly respected zoo. And it had relations with a lot of, and exchanges with zoos from all over the world. And that's what led to the arrival in the first place of those pandas. The zoo's still pretty great to visit. I don't think it's kept up to the standards of, say, like the Berlin Zoo, but it's still a wonderful zoo to visit.
Quite right.
So we've mentioned that there is a castle on top of Chapultepec Hill. The thing is that there's always been some level of infrastructure in and around this hill of Chapultepec. You can still visit the remains of the baths that Moctezuma, this king, used to use for ceremonial purposes. There's archaeological remains that date back even to the pre-classic era. We're talking around 200 to 400 years into the Common Era. But the most emblematic thing about Chapultepec today is Chapultepec Castle. And that is built during the Spanish time. First, as a just sort of a not particularly elaborate defensive structure on top of a hill. And then with time, it becomes more and more elaborate, eventually becoming a sort of summer palace for the viceroys of New Spain.
One has to really keep in mind, given that Chapultepec Park is in the heart of Mexico City today, that back in the day, Mexico City didn't span all that far out from its sort of historic center, downtown area today. Chapultepec was kind of a good ways out, right? Like it was almost a nice day out where you could pick up a picnic basket and head off for a few miles into the countryside before reaching Chapultepec Hill.
This is something that, you said that the Chapultepec is a sort of mirror, let's say, of the history of the country. That's for sure, but I think it's also an impeccable mirror of the development of Mexico City itself. So as Mexico City grows, so does Chapultepec grow and evolve continuously. And the different parts of the park reflect very clear sort of milestones in the history and development of Mexico City, which we'll get to in a little bit. But before that, something that's, I think, particularly interesting is the word castle is thrown around a lot. And if you travel in the US and Canada, you will hear, the castle from, the Gilded Age. A castle is generally a residential structure that was built originally for defensive purposes. The castles of the Gilded Age in the United States are homes. They're palaces that are called castles in the same way that sort of chateaus are called castles in France, which is, like a romantic idea. And it looks a bit like a castle, but it's not really a castle. What's interesting
Disney.
about exactly, very Disney, very Epcot Center. What's interesting about the Chapultepec Castle is that it is, if we're very strict, the only castle in the American continent. There is the Citadel in Quebec, of course, which is a semi-residential building that was for defensive purposes. You get other sort of similar structures on the coast, and you get similar structures in Cuba, you get similar structures in the coast in Mexico and other parts of the continent. But this is the only place that becomes fully residential while also being fully a defensive structure.
Defensive structure is what it was when the Americans descended onto Mexico City at the dramatic culmination of the Mexican-American War, or as it's known in Mexico, the War of the American Intervention. And that dramatic battle that took place in what was probably Mexico's sort of most heroic last stand, even beating your beloved Cinco de Mayo, Tavo. And the reason it's so historic and beloved is because the Mexican army at this point had been defeated quite categorically. And so by the time the Americans get to the outskirts of Mexico City, Chapultepec, this defensive fortification overlooking the city, it was actually a building in which the cadets of the military school resided. And so, Tavo, I'm going to test you now. What are the names of the famous boy heroes, as they're known, los niños héroes, the cadets that fought against the Americans as they arrived in 1848?
These are the sort of things that you're forced to learn when you're in school in Mexico, and they're so useless. The only one I remember is Juan Escutia.
So the one everyone remembers.
Yeah, but there's so many of them. Vicente Suarez is another one, but that's about it.
You've done probably double of what most people know. I think nobody knows anyone except for Juan Escutia, and for good reason too. They probably didn't exist. They are part of this national myth-making of the sort of self-sacrifice that every young Mexican should hold in their hearts. The story goes that as the Americans finally took over the fortifications, Juan Escutia, which is why he's so well known, wraps himself in the Mexican flag and chucks himself off the turret, sort of kind of pathetically. I was always very embarrassed when I was asked this question as a guide, and it was the question that people would ask, which is, where does Juan Escutia throw himself off of? And the problem is, like, physically, it doesn't work. The place where they say he fell doesn't work from the turret that he was supposed to have fallen from. Like he would have jumped the equivalent of like 100 meters to make his way over to where he's supposed to land. So it's a wonderful story for patriotic reasons, but probably untrue.
And I think, if I remember correctly, the part where like a lot of the guides tell you now that he jumped from, the only problem with that story is that part didn't exist in 1848.
Exactly.
That's an expansion that's made in the 1930s, I think.
Exactly right. And this is the thing, right? This is a building that is consistently evolving to reflect a lot of Mexico's national history. So in some ways, it's a practical building, taking the form that is needed when it is required. So at this point, it's a military structure overlooking the capital of the new Mexican Republic. But it is also sort of an ideological space, which reflects what people are feeling at the time and later on about their own history and stuff. So not only are these the halls of Montezuma, but it's also the historic and heroic place where the Niños Héroes, the boy heroes, died. And they're one of the biggest sort of modern nationalistic structures in the park that leads you into the park from its main entrance is the massive pillars that symbolize these boy heroes. It is also the entrance from probably the most important roadway that leads into Chapultepec. Not Chapultepec Avenue, a newer road, a more urbane road, we could say, that leads to the downtown area, but in a way that reflects the mores of the 19th century. And that is the road that we now know as El Paseo de la Reforma.
And it's a magnificent road. It's Mexico's monumental sort of ceremonial street. It's the street on which the military parades will go down. It's what they close down for big parades beyond the military parade. When you have the Dia de Muertos parade, when that started being a thing, it also goes down Reforma. Whenever Mexico scores a goal or wins, well, it doesn't happen often, but when Mexico wins a match in the World Cup, people from all over the city will rally around the Angel of Independence. For people who've been in Berlin, for example, I think it's very similar to the 17th of June Street, where you also have these very monumental structures, Angels of Victory kind of vibe. But I would argue it's even more impressive and more monumental than the street you see in Berlin or similar streets in other parts of Europe, because so much effort has been put into this one street, and it's absolutely outstanding. It's got these two massive medians packed with ahuehuetes and jacarandas, all sorts of beautiful trees.
And it is a beautiful triumph of European colonialism in Mexico.
100%. There is a reason why it looks a lot like Berlin and a lot like Vienna, particularly Vienna, because the person who has it built, like lays the foundation for a street that will look like a street we know today, is none other than the Austrian Archduke Maximilian of Habsburg, Emperor of Mexico.
This is the road that connected his imperial palace, which was turned from this military fortification into something closer to the vice-regal holiday homes of yore. And so he decided a modern and efficient way of getting to the capital would be to connect it with a very straight, rational line, very much a la Haussmann, from his palace, which he named El Palacio de Miravalle, which is alluding to the Valley of Mexico, and which is based on the name of his palace back in Europe, which was known as the Palace of Miramar, the palace that overlooks the sea. And in honor of his darling wife, Charlotte, of Belgium, he named this road the Paseo de la Emperatriz, the Empress's Avenue.
It's the closest thing to a sort of Mexican Champs-Élysées. But of course, Mexico being a republic, not a monarchy, when Maximilian is overthrown and killed, of course you can't keep the name the Avenue of the Empress. So of course we have to give it the complete opposite name, which is the Avenue of Reform. Because Benito Juarez, the man in charge or responsible for overthrowing Maximilian of Habsburg, is most famous for bringing in massive 19th century modernist reforms that separate church from state and really bring Mexico into modernity with all its pomp and circumstance.
And Chapultepec Castle today as a museum is pretty much entirely focused on this period of history, because it's probably the glitziest and most wonderful part in terms of the aesthetics and the way the palace was treated as a regal palace. And so a lot of the stuff that you have in there is recreating the rooms and the apartments of the royal family during the Mexican Second Empire, the reign of Maximilian. As a tour guide, one of my favorite things about it was this massive, beautiful, probably quite chilly, marble bathtub. And at the center, the sort of main hall at the center of the palace, is the contrast between the royal, imperial Mexico and the austere Republican Mexico. On one side, a massive gold-clad Donald Trump-style chariot that was meant to be drawn by dozens of horses or else it wouldn't move, and that was Maximilian's chariot. And then right in front of it, an austere, all-black carriage, probably good for just one horse, that trundled around Mexico as Benito Juarez avoided imperial troops and organized its uprising against the Second Empire. And that contrast is fascinating because it's supposed to show you what Mexico was meant to be, right? The sort of like the sumptuousness of the royals, yeah, whatever, and then, you know, the austerity and seriousness of the republic. Of course, when you go there, no one's looking at the tiny chariot.
Turns out shiny gilded things are much nicer to look at.
Yeah. And I think that one of the most famous occupants of Chapultepec Castle also understood this, even though he was a product of the Republic, even though he was the general that fought against the French troops at the Battle of Puebla. When he eventually rose to power and became president and then dictator of Mexico, he would also become a sort of king in this palace over the course of his 30-year rule. And this is Porfirio Diaz.
And I just love the sort of poetry of this, because of course, listeners who have listened to our podcast on the Cinco de Mayo battle, you'll know that it is Porfirio Diaz who is the officer at the time who leads the charge that ultimately leads the French to retreat from the Cinco de Mayo battle, thus making this battle a great victory for the Mexican forces. So it is this man who is a key player in stopping the first French imperial advance back in 1862. It is this man who, a few decades later, will then inhabit the palace meant for the emperor whose advance he was stopping in the first place.
Oh, the cyclicality of history. And that's the other half, let's say, of the Chapultepec Castle today, which is the life and times of Porfirio Diaz. So one half of the rooms contain Maximilian stuff, and then the other half of the rooms represent the Porfirian age. And what's fascinating is it shows you a bit of the life and times and prejudices of that period in time, which is more or less the end of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th. When I was a tour guide there, that was the most interesting thing for me, because on the surface, weirdly, all this really modern stuff that nobody had access to at the turn of the century now looks like the really old-fashioned, like bathroom that your granny used to have. But it was fascinating because these were really modern things like piped hot water, modern kitchens, and crucially, as Porfirio Diaz got older and more decrepit, one of the most interesting things was a massive lift shaft, an elevator that goes through the heart of Chapultepec Mountain and that you can access only if you are a special guest or a staff member to the museum. And so you go at the base of the mountain, you walk in, and then you go up through the heart of the mountain into the heart of Chapultepec Castle. Now, beyond this modern technology, you also had modern ideas, and you can't see me intensely air quoting, but modern here doesn't necessarily mean good, like your aunt will have you think. It's problematic modernism at the time, the sort of modernism that brought you phrenology and racial politics and the class segregation of the positivists. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is how Porfirio Diaz evolved over time. As people will know, Porfirio Diaz was a man of mixed origin. He was a man who was mestizo, so part European, part indigenous. But as time went on, he sort of lent into the Europeans to the extent that he'd powder his face white. And you can see this in the building itself, namely the fact that before he started entertaining these Europeans who became increasingly more relevant in his court, his Republican court, he would have staff go up and down the lift because apparently, it was useful. People carrying trays up and down the castle, it's a tough job. Until he was informed by the Europeans that this was terribly uncouth and that lifts should never be for staff. And so that rule was quickly instituted. What's funny, ironic now that now it's the exact opposite. It's only staff.
Long live the Republic.
And, of course, as time goes on, Porfirio Diaz also affects the cast in different ways. The most interesting and maybe even beautiful one is this massive stained glass window that completely covers a corridor that people say was built there by him because there was a draft. And as he got older, he got chilly. And so we've got this beautiful stained glass eagle that completely covers this corridor that was probably open back in the day because the man got older, more frail, and so he changed the building to suit his whims in a very similar way to which he changed Mexico according to his whims until
it all comes crumbling down with the revolution. To his credit, when that revolution does start in 1910, the revolution lasts 10 years, but he bows out very early on, and he actually says, if people don't want me anymore, then it's my time to go. And he very sort of tragically says goodbye to everyone, gets himself in a chariot, goes to Veracruz and takes a boat that takes him to Paris, and there he dies. He's like, goodbye. I will not be the reason why this country tears itself apart. And yet it did. But with the revolution, particularly the end of the revolution towards 1920, this ushers in Mexico into the more contemporary era. This is the beginning of a now uninterrupted era of a democratic republic, or at least semi-democratic republic, depends on how you want to analyze or define the PRI and its predecessor. And maybe the biggest sign of the fact that it's a semi-democratic republic is the fact that this palace that was built originally for the viceroys and then used by the emperor and then taken by this dictator who's overthrown becomes the home of the president of Mexico until 1939.
Which is the year in which, I assume, then President Lázaro Cárdenas is sitting on one of the many regal balconies overlooking the city in the park, thinking, this doesn't feel appropriate. And so looking out into the leafy park below him from the hill, he probably didn't spot it, probably couldn't see it from where he was standing, but play with me here. He probably spotted a little house at the center of what was back then known as El Rancho La Hormiga, the ant ranch.
Let me challenge you there. Little house of a ranch. This is the plantation home of an hacienda known as La Hacienda de la Hormiga, which has been rebranded as El Ranchito de la Hormiga.
But this is what's so important, Tavo. It's about the history that we believe deep down in our hearts. This will be very important close to a century later in 2018 when we have another sort of rebrand. But wait for me. Come on, play with me here. This is Lázaro Cárdenas, the great populist president, looking across the park from his castle and saying, we need to do better. We need to be more austere. And so he moves to the little ranch and says, this is going to be the new presidential residence, still in Chapultepec, but no longer in the palace.
Ah, you mean the famous tiny little shed of the garden of the ant. Yes, I know which one you mean.
Exactly, ant size. But yes, so basically the way the PRI comes to power, it comes to power under the facade of a new republicanism, a new social populist uprising, the product of the Mexican Revolution. But again, right, it is a big, big, big residence in the middle of one of the most beautiful pieces of real estate in Mexico City. At this point, Mexico City has spread out around the park. At the north, it's flanked by quite posh neighborhoods like Polanco and La Colonia Juárez. And at the south, it's flanked by more middle-class spaces, but it's still now very much surrounded by urban area.
Alex, this is supposed to be an episode on the Park of Chapultepec. Problem is, the Park of Chapultepec has 866, give or take, hectares. And I think we've spoken of about maybe 20?
Yes, it was supposed to be a little stroll around the park, and it turns out a bit like getting lost in the forest that is Chapultepec. And so this is probably not a bad place to drop off. We've reached we'll call it the modern age of Mexico. The park has been engulfed by the city, and a new dynamic, I think, will now take over, which I think we can discuss in the next episode on Chapultepec Park.
Until then, if you can, do take a stroll through the beautiful Castillo de Chapultepec and overlook the Paseo de la Reforma from that amazing balcony and see what I think is probably the best view that you can get of Mexico City.
Quite right. Till then, I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa. And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're talking about all the stuff that makes Mexico what it is, from the tiniest shrub to the mightiest ahuehuete.